the story begins with an uneasy thought experiment. Imagine waking one morning to find that your trembling hands, your clouded mind, your labored breath were not born of accident or fate, but of choices made centuries before you. Choices made by kings and queens, priests and courtiers, who believed they were safeguarding the purity of their blood, while in truth they were condemning their descendants to pain. For them, the sanctity of bloodlines mattered more than human health, more than love, more than the laughter of children who might run freely through palace halls. Their obsession with purity left no room for chance, no tolerance for outsiders, and in the end, no mercy for their children. This is not a fantasy. For centuries, European royals married and remarried their cousins, their nieces, even their siblings, believing that to dilute their blood was to weaken their claim to rule. They thought their lineage a divine river blessed by God, untouchable by commoners. What they failed to see was that this river, instead of flowing strong and pure, had become stagnant, poisoned by the very walls they built to protect it. And at the heart of this tragic experiment stood the Habsburg dynasty, whose marriages became a cautionary tale for generations. Their unofficial motto, whispered with both pride and irony, was simple: "Let others wage wars. You, happy Austria, marry." In practice, it meant that Habsburg rulers forged alliances not on the battlefield but in the marriage chamber. Yet the price of this strategy was not paid in treaties or in lost lands. It was paid in human bodies, in frail children, born with curved spines, weak lungs, protruding jaws, and minds that fractured under the weight of inherited instability. It was the women more often than not who bore this cost most directly. They were the vessels expected to carry the dynasty forward, even when their own health crumbled under the strain. By the 16th century, the royal families of Europe were less a series of distinct houses than a single sprawling vine of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. It was a system so entangled that family trees looked more like knots with branches folding back upon themselves. To an outsider, it might have seemed unnatural, even grotesque. But within those marble halls and gilded chambers, it was celebrated as strategy. Each union was hailed as a triumph, a reinforcement of divine right and power. Few asked what this meant for the child who would be born into a body already burdened with centuries of genetic debt. From this twisted legacy rose stories of individuals whose lives became synonymous with suffering. Some were written off as mad, others as cursed, still others remembered only as delicate figures in portraits painted to flatter a dynasty. But beneath those titles and brushstrokes lived real women, daughters and wives, queens and mothers, who endured lives shaped not by their own choices, but by ancestral arrogance. Their existence was often reduced to a single duty: to bear children who would extend the dynasty, no matter the cost to themselves. Our story takes us first to Vienna in the early 17th century, inside the Grand Hofburg Palace. Its corridors echoed with the sound of boots on polished stone, its chambers filled with the murmur of courtiers and the rituals of power. Yet behind velvet curtains and heavy wooden doors, away from the pomp of state, a child was born in 1634, whose very body carried the scars of her dynasty's obsession. Maria Anna of Austria, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand II, and Maria Anna of Bavaria, entered the world already burdened by what would come to be known as the Habsburg curse. Even in her earliest years, Maria Anna's struggles were impossible to ignore. While other children tumbled joyfully across palace courtyards, she labored to stand, her spine curved, unnaturally bending her body into a posture that made each breath an effort. Her jaw jutted forward so severely that even the simple act of chewing became an exhausting trial. Servants had to cut her food into tiny pieces, and every meal was a slow ritual of careful chewing, cautious swallowing, and the quiet shame of being different. The irony was bitter. The palace was filled with portraits of her ancestors, painted to immortalize their grandeur. But when Maria Anna looked at those canvases, she saw not glory but mirrors. An uncle with the same protruding chin, a grandmother whose shoulders slumped forward, her posture betraying a spine much like Maria Anna's. In each carefully painted face, Maria Anna recognized herself not as an heir to power, but as another victim of a dynasty that had chosen politics over humanity. Physicians came, often their robes heavy with the authority of learning, but their remedies pitifully inadequate. They whispered of God's will, of mysterious ailments, but never spoke aloud the truth that stalked the corridors of the palace. In private, they called it the Habsburg curse. In public, they prescribed bloodletting, restrictive diets, and prayers. To Maria Anna herself, they offered no comfort. She was both a patient and a specimen, measured and documented, as though she were a case study in suffering. Yet Maria Anna's mind remained sharp, unburdened by the physical decline of her body. Denied the joys of running and play, she turned inward. Books became her refuge, her window into worlds untainted by dynastic obsession. In stories, marriages were made for love. Children born from affection, not calculation. Her mind soared where her body could not. But even this fragile freedom was limited by the walls of her chamber and the expectations of her birth. Her life, like so many others in her family, was a short one. Maria Anna died at just 32 years old, her body finally yielding to the relentless toll of genetic damage. The official records listed her death as a result of illness, but the truth was etched far deeper. She died because her family believed blood was more valuable than life. From the dim halls of Vienna, our story soon shifts to Spain, where another Habsburg daughter faced a fate even more cruel. She would be remembered not for her body's deformities, but for her mind's collapse. History named her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly mad, or was madness simply a mask placed upon her to justify her imprisonment? Spain in the late 15th century was a kingdom at the height of its ambition. Under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchy expelled Jews and Muslims, cemented Catholic orthodoxy through the Inquisition, and launched voyages that reached across the Atlantic. It was a time of empire building and ruthless consolidation, but beneath the triumphs lay the same dynastic logic that haunted Vienna. The rulers of Spain, like their Austrian cousins, were convinced that the purity of their blood was their greatest treasure. Into this world in 1479, Joanna of Castile was born. History would remember her by another name, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Yet the true story of her life is far more complex and far more tragic than the cruel nickname suggests. As a young girl, Joanna was anything but mad. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and unusually well-educated for a princess of her time. She spoke Latin, French, and her native Castilian fluently. Tutors trained her in music, theology, and diplomacy, preparing her not just to be a wife, but a queen who might rule. Those who knew her as a child described a girl with a sharp mind, one who absorbed knowledge easily and showed curiosity beyond her years. But the seeds of her downfall were already sown, hidden deep in her bloodline. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, were themselves cousins, a match designed to unite the kingdoms of Spain rather than diversify its lineage. Her marriage was arranged, as all royal marriages were not for love, but for power. At 16, Joanna was sent north to marry Philip of Burgundy, known to history as Philip the Handsome. To the outside world, it was a glittering match that tied Spain to the rising power of the Habsburgs in Central Europe. But behind closed doors, it was a union of mismatched hearts. Philip was celebrated for his looks, but infamous for his arrogance and infidelity. To Joanna, raised to believe that marriage was sacred and loyalty divine, his coldness was a torment she could neither understand nor escape. In those years, her behavior began to draw whispers. When Philip strayed, Joanna clung tighter. When courtiers dismissed her, she responded with desperate passion. What later chroniclers called madness may have been at its root the frantic response of a young woman stripped of agency, humiliated in public, and trapped in a marriage that offered her neither respect nor affection. Modern psychologists, looking back, suggest that her outbursts and obsessive attachment were less symptoms of insanity than signs of deep depression, anxiety, and trauma conditions worsened by the genetic fragility of her bloodline. Her tragedy deepened in 1506, when Philip died, suddenly likely of typhoid fever. For Joanna, the loss was unbearable. She refused to bury him, keeping his coffin close, traveling across Spain with the decaying body of the man she had loved obsessively, if not wisely. Accounts tell of her opening the coffin to kiss his lifeless face, an image that horrified contemporaries, but also revealed the depth of her despair. To her, Philip's body was more than a corpse. It was the last link to a life that had already been taken from her by politics and betrayal. Her father Ferdinand saw an opportunity in her grief. By declaring Joanna unfit to rule, he claimed control of Castile for himself. Later, her son Charles, known to history as Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, would use the same justification to sideline her completely. For the next 46 years, Joanna lived imprisoned in the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. Her existence was reduced to dark rooms, meager food, and humiliations that stripped her of dignity. Attendants reported that she often screamed through the night, tore her clothes in anguish, or refused to bathe for weeks. But they also noted her moments of clarity, her quiet conversations with trusted confidants, her prayers whispered in Latin, her lingering sharpness. She was not wholly lost to madness. Modern historians argue that Joanna's so-called insanity was in many ways political theatre. To her enemies, a woman who grieved too much, who resisted too fiercely, was easier to discredit than to understand. The label of mad became a convenient tool, a way to remove her from power, while keeping her alive as a legitimizing symbol. Yet even politics could not erase the genetic undercurrents at play. Her family tree was riddled with signs of mental instability, anxiety, and depression conditions, passed down and intensified through generations of cousin marriages. What Joanna endured was not just the cruelty of men around her, but the weight of a dynasty already collapsing under its own obsession with bloodline purity. She died in 1555, still confined, still officially labelled insane. The world had already forgotten her as a ruler, remembered her only as a madwoman. But her story was not one of madness alone. It was a story of grief, of political betrayal, and of genetic fate. Her suffering was both personal and inherited, the result of choices made long before her birth, and choices made by men determined to silence her. Joanna's legacy is a warning, but not the last one. After her, the Habsburg dynasty would continue its dangerous experiment, marrying niece to uncle, cousin to cousin, until the line itself nearly collapsed. From Spain's gilded palaces to Austria's echoing corridors, the women of this dynasty would carry that curse in their bodies. Some bore children who did not survive infancy. Others, like Joanna, were trapped by a mind unraveling under impossible pressures. And still the marriages continued, as though no one dared to break the pattern. Our next story takes us into the golden halls of 17th century Madrid, where a little girl became both a princess and a symbol of dynastic desperation. She would be immortalized on canvas by Diego Velázquez, her small form draped in silks, her gaze caught between childhood innocence and dynastic burden. Her name was Margaret Teresa of Spain. Madrid, in the mid-17th century, was a city of splendor and shadows. The Spanish Empire still stretched across oceans, yet its heart was weakening, drained by endless wars and mismanagement. Inside the Alcázar Palace, however, appearances were everything. Courtiers gathered in glittering salons, rituals of ceremony filled the calendar, and artists worked tirelessly to immortalize the royal family as symbols of divine authority. Among them was Diego Velázquez, whose paintings preserved not only the grandeur of the Habsburg court, but also the fragility hidden beneath its silk and jewels. It was Velázquez who painted young Margaret Teresa, a child princess whose short life would come to symbolize the destructive legacy of dynastic obsession. Margaret Teresa was born in 1651, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. That detail, his niece, was not unusual by Habsburg standards. By then the family tree had folded back upon itself so many times that it resembled less a branching oak than a tightly wound knot. From birth, Margaret Teresa's future was already decided. She was promised in marriage to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, who happened also to be her uncle. For courtiers, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy. For Margaret Teresa, it was a sentence written before she could speak. Velázquez's portraits of her are haunting when viewed with modern eyes. At first glance they depict a doll-like child, dressed in elaborate gowns, stiff with brocade, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who attend her every gesture. But look closer, and the cracks begin to show. The small protrusion of the lower jaw, the stiffness in her posture, the slightly vacant quality in her eyes, all subtle signs of the genetic burden she carried. Velázquez, too skilled to flatter away reality, allowed those details to remain on canvas, even if softened. To contemporaries, she was the jewel of the dynasty. To us, she is also a fragile figure, already bearing the silent toll of centuries of inbreeding. At 15, she married Leopold I. He was 26, old enough to be her father and, more importantly, her uncle, by blood. The wedding was celebrated with processions, music, and public feasts. Chroniclers described it as a triumph for the empire, a bond between Madrid and Vienna. But for Margaret Teresa, it marked the end of childhood. Her role was no longer that of daughter or princess. It was that of dynastic vessel. Her life as empress was tragically short. She became pregnant almost immediately, her body still frail from youth, forced to endure the strains of constant childbearing. She delivered multiple children, but few survived beyond infancy. One daughter died within months. Another pregnancy ended in miscarriage. At last she bore a son who lived, but he inherited the same tangled web of Habsburg defects. Court doctors documented her physical decline with cold detachment. Bouts of fever, seizures, difficulty speaking, weakness that left her confined to bed. Today, modern medicine would likely diagnose severe anemia, perhaps epilepsy, and certainly the compounded effects of inbreeding depression. To her contemporaries, she was simply failing in her sacred duty. Margaret Teresa died in 1673 at just 21 years old. Officially, the cause was listed as fever. In reality, her body had been wrung dry by pregnancies and crippled by the accumulated damage of her family's marriages. Her death was mourned publicly, but not for her as an individual. Court chroniclers lamented the loss of potential heirs of what she might have contributed to the continuity of the dynasty. The tragedy of her humanity was barely noted. Her story, however, was not unique. Another Habsburg daughter, Anna of Austria, lived a parallel life across the Pyrenees in France. She too was married as a teenager, taken from Madrid at 14 to wed Louis XIII of France. Her marriage was designed to end decades of war between the two Catholic kingdoms, sealing peace with her body. But peace in politics did not mean peace in her life. The French court was a world apart from the rituals of Spain. Anna, already shy and anxious, struggled to adapt. Louis XIII was cold, distant, and emotionally withdrawn. Some historians suggest he may have been deeply depressed himself, perhaps even incapable of intimacy. Their union was strained from the beginning, and when years passed without a surviving heir, all blame fell on Anna. She endured miscarriages and stillbirths, each one deepening her despair. Physicians subjected her to humiliating examinations, bizarre treatments, and endless prayers. Some insisted she must fast. Others bled her to rebalance humors, and still others recommended pilgrimages and relics. Through it all, Anna grew increasingly anxious, withdrawn and isolated. Whispers spread through Versailles that she was cursed, that God disapproved of her Spanish blood. The pressure was immense. Without a son, France risked a succession crisis. Remarkably, after 23 years of marriage, Anna gave birth to Louis, the future Sun King. 2 years later, she bore another son, Philippe. To the court it was a miracle. To Anna it was both relief and exhaustion. Her value was finally secured. Yet the years of psychological torment had left scars. She remained a woman plagued by melancholy, digestive ailments, and episodes of what we would now call severe anxiety. Her later life was marked by devotion to religion, seeking solace, where human companionship had failed. She died in 1666, having outlived her husband, but carrying to her grave the weight of a life spent as a political instrument. Together, the stories of Margaret, Teresa, and Anna of Austria reveal a consistent truth. Royal daughters were not raised as individuals with dreams, but as pawns in an endless chess game of dynastic ambition. Their bodies bore the costs of inbreeding. Their minds buckled under the pressure of expectation. And still the system went on generation after generation, until even its most beautiful figure, Marie Antoinette, would find herself at the mercy of the same curse. By the 18th century, the Habsburg legacy had spread its shadow across nearly every royal court in Europe. Even when the marriages were not as dangerously close as uncle to niece, the genetic residue of centuries of inbreeding still coursed through the veins of their descendants. One of the most famous of them all, remembered as both a symbol of decadence and as a tragic queen, was Marie Antoinette. Born in 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. By the standards of the dynasty, their marriage was not particularly close, but it still carried with it the compounded inheritance of generations of cousin unions. When Marie Antoinette left Vienna for Versailles, as a 14-year-old bride, she carried more than silks and jewels. She carried the fragile blood of the Habsburg line hidden beneath her youthful beauty. Her marriage to Louis, the Dauphin of France, and later Louis XVI, was intended as a bond between Austria and France, a union meant to heal old wounds between the two Catholic powers. But from the beginning the union was beset with problems. Louis was shy, socially awkward, and possibly burdened with his own physical and psychological difficulties. Their marriage went unconsummated for 7 long years, feeding rumors that Marie Antoinette was frigid, or worse, infertile. In truth, the difficulties were more complex, a mix of Louis's hesitance and Marie's own struggles with anxiety, and what modern medicine might recognize as hormonal imbalance. The pressure upon her was immense. A queen's worth was measured by her children, especially her sons. As year after year passed without an heir, whispers turned to accusations. Pamphlets circulated, mocking her as barren, casting doubt upon her loyalty to France. Court doctors examined her, relentlessly probing, questioning, prescribing humiliating treatments. Few considered that the problem might lie in the very genetic inheritance she carried. When at last she did conceive, her pregnancies were fraught with difficulty. Severe morning sickness left her weak and bedridden. Her mood swung violently, with periods of nervous energy followed by deep depression. Her first daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived, but subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. The toll was not only physical but psychological, compounding the stress of her position with private grief that she was forced to endure in public silence. Marie Antoinette's struggles as a mother overlapped fatally with the growing unrest in France. Her fragility was weaponized against her. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," almost certainly a fabrication, was not meant to describe an actual remark, but to capture what her enemies saw in her. A queen detached from reality, indifferent to the suffering of her people. What they could not see, or chose not to see, was a young woman overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. A failing body, a troubled marriage, and the weight of centuries of genetic damage that shaped her health and temperament. As the revolution gathered storm, her behavior became more erratic. Witnesses described her alternating between manic activity and despair. Historians now debate whether these were circumstantial responses to terror and betrayal, or whether they revealed an underlying predisposition to mood disorders inherited from her Habsburg lineage. Either way, the perception of instability made her an easy target. Her imprisonment after the fall of the monarchy stripped away the last illusions of grandeur. Separated from her children, humiliated before the people she once ruled, she endured interrogations that pushed her into states of confusion and withdrawal. Accounts describe moments where she seemed detached from reality, as though dissociating to protect herself from unbearable stress. And yet at her trial and execution in 1793, she displayed a dignity that defied her enemies. She apologized for accidentally stepping on her executioner's foot before the blade fell. That small gesture of courtesy in the face of annihilation revealed the core of her character. A woman broken by circumstance, but still capable of grace. Marie Antoinette's tragedy was not hers alone. It was the culmination of a centuries-long experiment in keeping bloodlines pure. The same features that marked her face, the slightly protruding jaw, the narrow chin, had appeared in countless Habsburg portraits before her. The same struggles with fertility and mental health had haunted her great-grandmothers and cousins. She was both a Queen of France and the echo of generations of Habsburg women who had carried the curse before her. Her death did not end the story. To understand the full weight of this genetic catastrophe, one must look to Spain, where the dynasty reached its most disastrous conclusion. There, in the late 17th century, the Habsburg line produced its final, most tragic heir. Charles II, a king so riddled with genetic defects that he was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But the truth of his condition was not witchcraft. It was the inevitable result of centuries of cousin marrying cousin, a family tree collapsing inward until it destroyed itself. And while Charles became the tragic symbol of dynastic failure, his sisters and cousins, the Infantas of Spain, suffered quietly in the shadows. Their bodies too bore the curse. Their lives too were sacrificed at the altar of politics. They were married off despite seizures, deformities, and illnesses, expected to carry pregnancies that almost always ended in tragedy. Their stories remind us that the curse did not end with kings nor with queens. It trickled down through every child forced into a role their bodies could not sustain. Theirs is where we turn next, for in them we see not just the grandeur of courts, but the raw, painful evidence of what happens when humanity is sacrificed to the illusion of purity. In the final decades of the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty collapsed under the unbearable weight of its own design. At its center was King Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the child who would come to symbolize both the persistence and the destruction of the bloodline. His very existence was a medical riddle. He was the product of 16 generations of inbreeding, his genetic coefficient so high that it rivaled that of children born to brother-sister unions. And yet he was the king, the living embodiment of an empire stretched from Madrid to Mexico City, from Naples to the Philippines. Charles II was frail from the moment he entered the world. He did not walk until the age of 8. He could not speak until nearly 4. His body was grotesquely misshapen. His jaw jutted forward so dramatically that chewing was nearly impossible, and saliva constantly dribbled from his mouth. He was epileptic, plagued by frequent seizures, and so physically weak that courtiers whispered he could barely hold up the weight of his crown. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, attributing his condition to curses or dark magic. But no spells were needed. The cause was written in the marrow of his bones, in the genes that had been folded back upon themselves for centuries. More tragic still was the expectation laid upon him. As king, he was required to produce an heir to continue the line. But Charles was impotent, unable to consummate his marriages, and his wives bore no children. His court, desperate for continuity, subjected him to humiliating rituals and bizarre treatments. Physicians prescribed potions and charms. Priests performed exorcisms. At one point he was made to drink a concoction of ground-up human skulls believed to cure his condition. All of it failed because the problem was not witchcraft or demons, but the very design of his lineage. Yet Charles II was not the only victim. His sisters and cousins, the Spanish Infantas, lived equally tragic lives, their stories often overlooked. These young women born into palaces were raised not as individuals but as bargaining chips in dynastic marriages, and like their brother they bore the unmistakable signs of genetic collapse. One sister, Maria Margarita, struggled with severe developmental delays. Court records describe her as unable to speak clearly until the age of 7, with difficulty walking, and signs of what modern medicine would identify as autism spectrum disorders. Another, Maria Theresa, suffered from epilepsy, so violent that attendants feared for her life with each attack. Her spine was curved, her jaw so malformed that she could eat only soups and soft foods. Despite their conditions, these women were not spared the cruel expectations of dynastic duty. They were married off to cousins and uncles, their frail bodies forced into pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or in the birth of children even more deformed than themselves. Letters from the time reveal the heartbreak behind the gilded walls of Madrid's Alcazar Palace. Mothers wrote of infants born so weak, they survived only hours, of daughters confined to bed with constant bleeding, of the silent despair that followed each funeral procession for a child who never reached its first year. The palace itself became more infirmary than court. Physicians, surgeons, and priests worked in teams tending to children who seemed less heirs to an empire than patients in a vast medical experiment. Their reports catalogued a litany of conditions: epilepsy, deformities, seizures, infertility, mysterious fevers, and what we now know as autoimmune disorders. And yet no one in power dared to acknowledge the obvious cause. The marriages continued, one cousin wedding, another one uncle wedding a niece, all in the name of preserving blood that had long since turned to poison. The tragedy of these women was not only physical, it was psychological, raised from birth to believe that their only value lay in their ability to produce heirs. They lived in terror of their own pregnancies. Each conception was both a hope and a threat, a chance to prove themselves useful, and a near certainty of loss or death. Many fell into despair, withdrawing from public life, hiding away in private rooms where grief and shame consumed them. Without the language of genetics to explain their suffering, they often interpreted it as divine punishment, believing they were cursed or unworthy. Their anguish was deepened by guilt, as though their broken bodies were somehow their fault rather than the predictable result of centuries of arrogance. The death of Charles II in 1700 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. He left no heir, no future for the dynasty that had once ruled half the world. His passing sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that redrew the map of Europe and heralded the rise of new powers. But beyond politics, his death was a symbol of something larger: the inevitable collapse of a system that had valued bloodline purity above human survival. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. The Habsburg experiment had produced generation after generation of suffering, particularly among the women who had no choice in the matter. They were painted as saints, queens, and princesses, but in reality they were patients, living testaments to the danger of turning family trees into cages. Their beauty was fleeting, their lives often brief, their bodies laboratories of genetic disaster. And yet from their pain came knowledge. Centuries later, scientists studying the records of the Habsburgs would uncover clear proof of how inbreeding amplifies recessive traits, how it weakens immune systems, and how it devastates fertility. The very tragedies that destroyed these families provided the evidence that would shape the science of genetics. It was a cruel irony. Their suffering illuminated truths that would eventually save others from the same fate. From the Spanish infantas to Marie Antoinette, from Joanna of Castile to Margaret Theresa, the story was always the same. Women caught in a web of duty, their bodies used as instruments of politics, their pain ignored until it became impossible to overlook. They were not remembered for their laughter or their dreams, but for the children. They failed to bear the illnesses. They could not overcome the madness that men declared convenient. Yet if we listen closely, their stories still speak. They remind us that bloodline purity was never noble, never sacred. It was a curse disguised as tradition, a legacy of power, purchased with the lives of those least able to resist it. Our journey now reaches its final chapter, where we step back from the palaces and the portraits to ask a larger question. What did it all mean? What lessons did humanity take from this grand, tragic experiment in keeping bloodlines pure? The story of the Habsburgs does not end with the death of Charles II in 1700, but his passing without heirs marked the breaking point. His body had been so ravaged by genetic damage that one physician who examined him remarked that the king's corpse contained nothing but air. That grotesque observation was less insult than diagnosis. Charles was the living conclusion of centuries of deliberate inbreeding, a dynasty that had destroyed itself in the pursuit of what it thought was divine purity. His death unleashed the War of Spanish Succession, but it also forced Europe to confront a truth that had been whispered in corridors for generations, that a family tree twisted back upon itself eventually collapses. To understand why the Habsburgs suffered so catastrophically, one must step into the realm of science. When close relatives marry, their children inherit not just the familiar features of the family, the shape of a jaw, the color of eyes, but also the hidden recessive traits that healthy genetic diversity usually conceals. Harmful mutations that might remain dormant in one parent can become deadly when matched with the same gene from another. The result is inbreeding depression, weakened bodies, fragile immune systems, lowered fertility, and increased susceptibility to mental illness. The Habsburg jaw, that infamous protrusion, immortalized in portrait after portrait, was the visible tip of an iceberg that included epilepsy, developmental delays, and infertility. What is striking is how openly these problems were recorded at the time. Court physicians measured jawlines, documented seizures, and listed miscarriages with clinical detachment, yet the reports were treated as curiosities rather than warnings. The connection between repeated cousin marriages and illness was clear enough that even commoners sometimes mocked the royals for it, and yet the system continued. Why? Because the stakes of power were judged more important than the lives of individuals. An heir with deformities was still an heir, and to dynasties obsessed with survival that was better than diluting the blood with a common match. The Catholic Church played a role too. Despite scriptural warnings against consanguinity, dispensations were routinely granted for unions between close kin. The Church justified this by framing royal blood as divinely ordained, and therefore worthy of preservation even at the cost of human suffering. In doing so, it provided a moral and legal shield for what became a slow-motion catastrophe. The women bore the greatest burden. They were reduced to vessels, judged valuable only by their ability to bear sons. Their suffering was dismissed as divine mystery, their illnesses hidden behind curtains, their despair interpreted as personal weakness. Joanna of Castile's grief was rebranded as madness. Anna of Austria's miscarriages were blamed on her supposed defects as a woman rather than the genetic damage she had inherited. Margaret Theresa's decline was met not with pity, but with anxiety over the succession. Even Marie Antoinette, centuries later, was attacked not only for her politics, but for her failures in the bedroom and nursery. The dynasty treated its women as instruments, and in doing so it revealed one of the cruelest truths of history. When power is prioritized above humanity, the human body itself becomes the battlefield. And yet from this suffering came knowledge. Centuries later, geneticists, studying the Habsburgs' family tree, were able to trace patterns that helped confirm modern theories of heredity. The high rate of miscarriages, the clustering of epilepsy and depression, the exaggerated features of the jaw, all provided a record of what happens when genetic diversity is stripped away. Without meaning to, the Habsburgs became a vast, unwilling experiment in the consequences of inbreeding. Their tragedy contributed to our understanding of why genetic variation is vital, why cousin marriage carries risks, and why the health of populations depends on openness rather than isolation. This does not excuse the suffering, nor does it make the pain of those women less real, but it does mean their stories were not entirely lost to futility. They remind us that even from cruelty, some lessons can be preserved. Today, in small isolated communities across the world, cousin marriage still persists, often with similar consequences. The warning from history is clear. Purity is a dangerous illusion, and the attempt to preserve it often leads to collapse. When we return to those individual women, Maria Anna bent and breathless in Vienna, Joanna of Castile pacing in her dark cell, Margaret Theresa fading after endless pregnancies, Anna of Austria whispering prayers in Versailles, Marie Antoinette walking to the guillotine, we see not queens and princesses alone, but human beings who carried within them centuries of choices they never made. They were not the authors of their destinies, but the inheritors of mistakes. And yet in their small acts of resilience in reading, when bodies failed, in clinging to love, when betrayed in holding dignity, even on the scaffold, they asserted something larger than dynasties. They asserted their humanity. The Habsburgs' obsession with pure bloodlines ended not with triumph but with extinction. But their legacy lingers not only in the portraits that hang in museums, not only in the history books that record their reigns, but in the lessons that genetic science continues to draw from their suffering. Their lives are a testament to the cost of valuing ideology over compassion, tradition over health, and power over love. Perhaps that is why their stories still haunt us. They remind us of a simple truth that seems so obvious now, yet was ignored for centuries. That nobility is not found in the purity of blood, but in the courage to embrace our shared humanity. The daughters of the Habsburgs, silenced in their time, still whisper across the centuries. Remember us, they say, not as queens, not as wives, not as mothers. Remember us as human beings who deserved better than the fate that politics and genetics conspired to give us. Their voices, though faint, are part of our inheritance. And it is up to us to ensure that their suffering is not repeated, that the pursuit of purity never again demands such a devastating human price.